Okay, good morning. Welcome. My name is Max Latona. I'm the Executive Director for the Center for Ethics and Society here at St. Anselm College. And I want to thank all of you for attending today's event, the launch of the New Hampshire Zoning Atlas. This is a wonderful turnout for a wonderful occasion. And I know we have roughly twice as many people online as we have here in person. So thank you all for coming out or tuning in, as it were. So the New Hampshire Zoning Atlas is an exciting project that the Center for Ethics and Society, New Hampshire Housing, and the State Office of Planning and Development have together been working on for well over a year now, and it is now complete. Today, we will unveil the atlas for you. We will explain what the New Hampshire Zoning Atlas is, how it was developed, and how it can be used. In addition, we'll plan to share with you some key findings about zoning and housing that have emerged from the project, as well as to discuss the implications and impact that the Atlas can have going forward. Along the way, we'll hear from two distinguished persons whose support for this project was critical, and from a panel discussion of community leaders on their thoughts about the Atlas. So we hope you enjoy the proceedings. I must tell you, I'm personally very excited about the launch of the New Hampshire Zoning Atlas, both because I think it's been one of the hardest things that the center has ever done, but also quite possibly one of the most important things that we've ever done. So ever since we started the Housing We Need initiative some 5+ years ago, we've been aware that some forms of zoning, what we could call restrictive zoning, is one of the primary culprits in the shortage of supply of affordable homes, causing hardship for individuals, families, and employers alike. And yet somehow conveying the message about restrictive zoning to our communities has been incredibly difficult. After all, no single community zoning code is responsible for our housing crisis, and the zoning ordinances across the state are complex and different and cannot be reduced to any one single problematic feature. The result has been is that it's been difficult for any of us to grasp, much less to explain to others, the aggregate impact of all of these codes. That is to show in any kind of demonstrable way just how the land use regulations of each community combine with the land use regulations of other communities to produce a serious shortage of homes. All of this potentially changes with the Atlas. The Atlas is a powerful tool for all of us across the state to understand, and by that I mean to quantify as well as visually illustrate just how our zoning is collectively affecting housing supply and affordability. So how does it do that? How does the Atlas do that? What is the New Hampshire Zoning Atlas? The New Hampshire Zoning Atlas is a collaborative project to research, catalog, digitize, and graphically display all of New Hampshire's housing-related zoning regulations, community by community, district by district. This was a labor-intensive undertaking that you will hear more about in a minute. Not a single stone was left unturned in our attempt to code these regulations and make them available for analysis and illustration. But it is important to note that the Atlas is a policy-neutral tool for analysis. It does not state what specific policy changes should be made or how they should be made, whether at the community level or otherwise. But it does provide the tools, the information, and the data for our community leaders and policymakers to make those decisions. Okay, at the conclusion of today's event, all of you, along with the public at large, will have access to the Atlas, our data, our findings, and all the other materials that we have. With the intention of updating the Atlas annually, we fervently hope that the Atlas will be a useful tool for you for many years to come. Useful for researchers, policymakers, community leaders, planners, journalists, builders and developers, advocates, and more to gain a better understanding of how our zoning can be adjusted to ease the affordable housing shortage. Now, before I introduce our first speaker, I'd like to acknowledge the center had incredible help from a wide variety of individuals and organizations without whom this project would never have happened. And I'd like to take a moment to thank them. Now, first are the members of the center's advisory board, whose quiet and constant support and guidance of the center, often behind the scenes, makes all of our work possible. If you're a member of the center's advisory board, I'd like you to stand and be recognized. And I think there's only one here. Dean, could you just stand? Yes, Dean Kristen. He's the chair of our advisory board, and his support has been very valuable for me personally. Second is our leadership team, whom you will hear from shortly. This team includes Ben Frost, Deputy Executive Director and Chief Legal Officer of New Hampshire Housing, Noah Hodgetts, Principal Planner in the New Hampshire Office of Planning and Development, Rick Lederer Barnes, a GIS Specialist and Environmental Planner for Upstate GIS, Sarah Marchant, Chief of Staff and Vice President of Rock NH Community Loan Fund, and Jason Sorens, Senior Research Faculty at the American Institute for Economic Research. I'd also like to express on behalf of that leadership team our gratitude to a team of valuable consultants who are not shown here. That team includes Mark Fougier, Christina Harold, and Alex Rudowski. They provided important support along the way, including knowledge of land use law, GIS expertise, and coordination of our team of interns. Speaking of which, we should all take a moment to thank a very, very special group of people who are the real stars of this project. They are the student interns who live in New Hampshire but attend colleges and universities across the Northeast. You saw some of them and heard some of their voices on the screen before the program started. They joined the project because they were inspired by the opportunity to help New Hampshire, to help our state better understand our own land use regulations, to help our communities become more welcoming to people of diverse backgrounds and socioeconomic status, to help all of us solve our own affordable housing shortage. That inspiration led them to work all of last summer reading some 23,000 pages of zoning code, poring over hundreds of zoning maps, and filling out spreadsheets with over 400,000 pieces of data. I just want to mention them by name. They are Jacob Akey, Thomas Donovan, Carolyn Hill, and Donald Jepson from St. Anselm College, Eli Cronin from Mary Baldwin University, Alyssa Papantanakis from Gettysburg College, Sam Latona from Cornell University, and Isabel Bloom from Colgate University. I know that some of these interns are online and some are here in person, but if any of them are here in person, I'd ask them to stand for their peers and be recognized for their hard work. The entire state of New Hampshire is grateful to you. Okay, finally, I'd like to acknowledge our partners. First and foremost, as I've already mentioned, our New Hampshire Housing and the State Office of Planning and Development, both of whom provided incredible expertise, manpower, data, and in the case of New Hampshire Housing, funding in seeing this project through to completion. But I'd also like to thank the New Hampshire Realtors, the Charles Koch Foundation, the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, and Evernorth for their generous financial support for our work. We would not have even begun this project, much less completed it, if it were not for them. Okay, I'd now like to welcome to the podium to say a few words, Rob Dappas, the Executive Director of one of our main partners in this project, New Hampshire Housing. Rob?
Thank you, Max. Good morning, everyone. It's so nice to see you, and I'm truly excited to be here. I want to start with a few words of thank you and congratulations to the team, to the leadership team, to my colleagues at New Hampshire Housing, led by Ben, to Noah Hodgetts and the team at OPD, to Rick and the team of consultants and interns and advisors, and Sarah, who worked so hard to make this day a reality, and of course to Max and Jason and the team at St. Anselm. Thank you also to Sarah Bronin and her team of pioneers at Desegregate Connecticut, who built the first zoning atlas. Thank you for leading the way, and thank you for joining us here today. So I've had the opportunity to make similar and forgettable remarks at a number of events over the past year and a half since assuming this position. I've done groundbreakings and ribbon cuttings and rubber chicken dinners and annual conferences, and they've all been pleasant. And the ones that have been associated with new housing have truly been worthy of celebration. But I'd submit to you that none of them when we look back on our housing history in New Hampshire, will be as significant as this day. None will demarcate our housing history in terms of a before and an after. And why is that? Why do I think that today is so important? It's because I think we're at a turning point today. We've come a really long way. Not so long ago, it used to be perfectly acceptable to say in polite company, we don't have a housing problem in New Hampshire. We don't have an affordability problem. When I drive around, I see housing, I see people in it. We don't want any more school children that are going to drive up our taxes. If we need more housing, let the cities build it. And of course, everybody's favorite, whether spoken or unspoken, we don't need any more of those people in our town. Now, those of us who are engaged in the work of meeting the housing needs of our state still hear things like this, but it's getting rarer and it's getting less socially acceptable. And more, people realize now that the statements like these, to make a statement like these, is to turn a blind eye to the terrible mistakes that we've made in the misbegotten history of land use policies in the past century. That in and of itself is an amazing accomplishment. And we rightly celebrate the work of those who have turned on the light so we can see for ourselves the injustice around us in the form of tyrannical and discriminatory land use policy. Policies which promised us safe and idyllic suburbs, but are suffocating economic growth and are driving up housing prices to the point where we have a homelessness crisis among our senior citizens and working people. Policies which we believed would protect our environment and rural character, but have done just the opposite, contributing to sprawl and environmental degradation. People are starting to realize this. They are becoming aware. But awareness only gets us part of the way there. The next step is understanding the details of these exclusionary policies. So often, when I travel around the state, when I talk to people about housing, the question that I get is, what should towns and cities be doing? What should concerned citizens be doing? What should I be doing? And until now, so often, I've given them a convoluted and unsatisfactory answer. Something like, get to know your town's zoning ordinance. Here's a town that's made some good changes. Google that one. Open up those two 180-page PDFs, maybe do a Control F for table of dimensional requirements, put them side by side, ask for some help from your overworked planner, if there is one. Try to make yours a little bit more like this good one, and then try to get all your neighbors jazzed up about it. Until now, at best, sometimes we've been able to say, we can help you pay for a professional to do this incredibly complex work that you still won't understand. And is it any wonder that we find ourselves in this mind-blowing situation where, according to the most recent UNH Granite poll that measures issues which are important to New Hampshire residents, housing is the most important. It's not even close. It blows away the second most important issue to Granite staters by a margin of something like 3-1. And yet, so many towns and cities across New Hampshire have done very little to address the housing crisis. Well, I say to you, don't wonder why that is. Don't wonder what is the disconnect. The disconnect is the system of land use regulations is incredibly complicated. It is not accessible. It is not understandable. So many caring, intelligent, dedicated people, including those who already serve on planning and zoning boards, people who I call my friends, have done very little to address this crisis because it's so freaking complicated. But today's launch of the New Hampshire Zoning Atlas marks a new dawn in the availability and the accessibility of information about land use policies across our state. And I feel lucky. I think we're all fortunate to be here today because we're at a point in our history where a great mistake has been made. And it took us a long time to get here, but now we see it. And now our friends and neighbors and family members who are not housing geeks are starting to see it. The Zoning Atlas will allow all of us to see it and to understand it. And once we can understand it, we can solve it. It's not going to be easy, but it's not going to be any harder than what we've had to do to get to this point. So thank you. This is a tool. Let's see what it can do, and then let's get out there and use it.
Thank you, Rob. There's one other extremely important partner that is not mentioned here, but I'd like to introduce to you now. And it's the National Zoning Atlas. The National Zoning Atlas, as you can see from this map, is supporting atlases like ours across the United States. There's over 20 states that are currently working on their atlases. And the National Zoning Atlas and their team provide constant advice on funding, organizational structure, and methodology for each of these organizations, including ours. We are grateful to them for their support over the last year and a half. And I will note, however, looking at this map, that New Hampshire is actually ahead of the curve. As of today, we are the third state in the nation to complete a comprehensive atlas after Connecticut and Montana. So I think we should be proud of ourselves here in the Granite State. So, but regarding the National Zoning Atlas project, we're particularly grateful to one person in particular, its founder and director, Sarah Bronin. So Sarah is on public service leave from her position as a professor of planning and law at Cornell University. She holds a Juris Doctor from Yale Law School as a Truman Scholar, a Master's of Science from the University of Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar, and a Bachelor of Architecture and a Bachelor of Arts from the University of Texas. As some of you may recall, Sarah visited our Housing We Need Forum in December of 2021 and inspired all of us here with her presentation of the Connecticut Zoning Atlas. What you may not know is that along with Ilya Ilancu, she wrote the manual How to Make a Zoning Atlas, and she spends hours every day answering complex zoning questions from teams and states around the country, all as part of her support and guidance for what we call the National Zoning Atlas Project. So please join me in welcoming Sarah to the podium, back to the Center for Ethics and Society at St. Anselm College.
Gosh, that was very, very nice. The credit is all to this team, though. So as Max said, I'm here representing the National Zoning Atlas, which actually was inspired in turn by my visit here in December 2021. Because as I came to present the Connecticut Zoning Atlas, lots of questions, maybe some of you were there that day from the audience about, well, how did you do it? What did you code? What partners were involved? How can we do it here? And after that meeting on the drive home, I went, oh man, I think I'm gonna have to do something about this, which then inspired me to write this how-to guide, to field questions from other team members, prospective teams in other states, and ultimately simply announce that there was a National Zoning Atlas. I bought the URL, zoningatlas.org, posted what I had on the Connecticut and the Montana team, the New Hampshire team, as the first three, and then just kept posting. And, we keep filling in this map as new states get on board. But I will say for me, it was inspirational to be here and to hear that other people might be interested in doing a zoning atlas, because we're all across the country experiencing the same issues when it comes to housing affordability, housing availability, even basic questions like whether we are actually zoning for the right kinds of land uses in the right kinds of places. From here today, I'm actually going to Portsmouth to speak at the History Above Water Conference, where attendees will be grappling with issues related to sea level rise that affect our historic places. And so for those of you familiar with downtown Portsmouth, increased flooding has led to greater risks in that area. And to the extent that zoning plays a role in pushing development into areas that are prone to sea level rise, we now will know that information from this atlas too. So I'll just put a note there to say that what the impacts of the Connecticut Zoning Atlas, or the inspiration for the Connecticut Zoning Atlas, and I know for your zoning atlas, is housing and housing affordability and availability. But there's lots of other dimensions of the zoning atlases that are being developed around the country. Information that it will give us about the way we develop, impacts on the environment, impacts on our transportation development, it impacts on other infrastructure and where we put it and how we invest and so on. So just a couple notes about the national project, so you could put this in context. We now have 24 state teams that are working diligently across the country. We have about 50 institutions. We've now raised enough funding at the national team, which is housed in my lab at Cornell University, to have 8 staff members, which is a lot better than 0, and a lot better than me, personally answering everything that comes in and trying to figure out GIS and Python and things I definitely do not know. And lots of interns who are, I think, as Max said, powered this project and power the projects all over the country. So I do want to give a special shout out to the interns and all of your work, because 23,000, 32,000 pages in Connecticut, another thousands and thousands of pages in Montana. Somebody's reading those, and somebody's reading those with care. And that is the students. And in the case of the New Hampshire project, the leadership team, who I know was very, very involved as well. I wanted to just say a few words too about the quality of the team that produced the National Zoning Atlas. So again, if you were here convening in December 2021, you know that the Institute of Politics is not a stranger to tackling important questions that are facing the state and bringing together leaders from across the political spectrum and the policy world to address them. The fact that Max was willing to be the director of this project and bring all of the people in this room together, all of the project partners, to raise the funds that were needed to do this project right, is a real testament to Max. And the fact that there's so many leading players in the housing world that have been leaders on this project too, is again a testament to the quality and the breadth of this team. So for me, the New Hampshire Zoning Atlas team is a model for all of these other states. When people ask us, well, have you ever had a project team with the state agency involved? Yes, we have, and we can point to New Hampshire. Have you ever had a project team with the university as the lead, with other public partners? And we say, yes, we can, and New Hampshire is the model. Which has been your most successful team in terms of gathering the resources and the support and the financial support needed to do this right? And we point to the New Hampshire team. So this team is a team third to be finished, but I think extremely influential in the way that the rest of the projects get developed simply by virtue of the quality of its work and the model that has been put together here, really from scratch. Just like, you know, this whole effort has just been, you know, an ad hoc until now. And, you know, as people have done important work and provided these models, we take them and run with them. So much so that when we spoke at the American Planning Association conference last month, there were, I think, maybe 250 or 300 people in the room to hear from Max and a couple of other project leaders about how they had done it. And these are planners from all over the country seeking potentially to do their own projects. So that's all just to put this atlas in context, to explain, just add a little bit to the housing dimension, to explain why this project could be important for a vast number of policy decisions that are facing and issues that are facing the state, to applaud the New Hampshire team, to thank you all for being here, to thank you for your partnership in this project, because of course, you know, we have these teams across these states, and the fact that it's a two-way street, that we're learning so much from the state teams and that we're then passing that forward. Again, we're really grateful for that. So I encourage you to check this atlas out. I'm excited to hear as much as I can from the presentation before dashing off to Portsmouth, but this is really important work. Thank you all for being here, and thanks to the team. It's awesome.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for the kind words. So now we are going to go to the Atlas. So we are going to show you the Atlas, talk a little bit about the methodology and data that went into the Atlas, share with you some of our main findings that we've pulled from the Atlas thus far, and then talk about the impact and implications of the Atlas going forward. So to do all that, I'm going to invite the leadership team to come forward to the stage. So it's Rick Lederer-Barnes, Jason Sorens, Sarah Marchant, Noah Hodgetts, somewhere here, there he is, and Ben Frost. So please come to the stage, and let's get to the Atlas.
All right, so my role in the project was managing the interns who put in all the data, read all the zoning codes, and I led the review process. We had several rounds of review, both automated and manual, and then we put it out to the regional planning commissions and professional planners around the state to give their input. So as Max mentioned, we have about 400,000 individual pieces of data. That's about 200 different variables corresponding to different regulatory features in these zoning ordinances, and over 2,000 zoning districts in the state. Everything is coded as of June 1, 2022. We wanted a consistent date so that we can compare like with like, right? We're comparing all these jurisdictions around the state as of the same day, June 1st, 2022. We also looked at subdivision and site plan review ordinances. So we really try to get into the land use regulations to truly understand how these jurisdictions are regulating housing, as well as some other features. So we have 269 jurisdictions in our data set. That's more than the number of towns and cities in New Hampshire, because it includes a few places, 9 village districts and 1 port authority, that have their own independent zoning apart from the towns that they're a part of. We also have 23 unincorporated townships that are zoned by the Coos County Planning Board, and 2 unincorporated townships without zoning. One of them is uninhabited. So those are the jurisdictions we've got. And then we've got 2,139 districts. We classify them at the top level as residential versus non-residential. Residential is where housing development is allowed in some form. And those in turn are subdivided into areas where no general category of commercial or industrial use is allowed. So it's pretty much only housing, as well as some incidental commercial uses, and those are considered primarily residential. And then we have districts that are mixed with residential, where you can have at least some general category of commercial or industrial use along with residential development. There are 3 categories then of non-residential districts. We classify them as primarily commercial, primarily industrial, or primarily conservation or agricultural. We code a number of different use regulations. What types of residential uses are allowed? Single family structures, 2-unit structures, 3-unit, 4-unit, or 5+ unit structures. We have variables for affordable housing. So if you have units that are required to be affordable, does that give you some kind of density bonus? We have information on the definition of affordability in each district, and whatever bonuses are available. We also have regulations on accessory dwelling units or in-law apartments, and on manufactured housing. Then for each type of residential use, we have a number of other regulations, dimensional and parking regulations. So dimensional regulations are things like minimum lot size, maximum lot coverage, maximum height, minimum unit size, maximum number of bedrooms, things like that. And then parking is the number of spaces required per unit. All right, so that gives you an overview of what we collected. And now I'm going to hand it over to Rick Lederer Barnes to take you through the website, nhzoningatlas.org, which is now live.
Okay. Just take this screen. There we go. Okay, so if you go to nhzoningatlas.org, this is the page you will come to. We begin with just some introductory statements about the Zoning Atlas, what it is, how we got here, recognizing and linking to the National Atlas Project. Then there's a series of findings, our key 6 findings, which our team is going to go through during the later part of this presentation. So I'm not going to go through them right here. There's this visual summary of the atlas. For those familiar, this is a story map format, which takes you through all the background, the methodology, those 6 key findings, as well as some additional findings that we had throughout the process of the atlas. There's links to the actual atlas map, and some concluding remarks as well. Then we have the actual interactive atlas. There's a tutorial on how to use the atlas, which I'm going to show you momentarily, and then a link for the atlas itself. After that, we have the actual data that went into the atlas. So you can click that link and get access to all the data, so you can do whatever analyses you want to do on your own. There's different data sets in there. There's a Google Sheet that has every zoning district that we coded, whether we mapped it in the atlas or not. And then there's the GIS files. If you have access to GIS software and want to do your own mapping, there's a CSV file if you just want to bring it into a spreadsheet and do some analyses. There's also a paper that Jason wrote that has a lot more detail on some of the methodology and many other sort of individual findings for different jurisdictions across the state, counties, things like that. We do note that there could be corrections. As Jason said, we froze the data as of June 1st, but there were, over about 400,000 pieces of data that went into the spreadsheets, 23,000 pages of zoning code that were gone through by our great interns. But there's bound to be a few things that we might have missed or mistyped or something like that. So if you find something like that, please reach out to us at this link and let us know so we can fix that. And as we said, going forward, we hope to update the atlas annually or every other year. So these updates will be ongoing, and we will archive where it is now, so you can compare the zoning as of 2022 to 24, 26, et cetera. There's a link to the video that was playing earlier of our interns, our leadership team, a way to contact us, and of course, our generous sponsors. So I will just quickly show you the tutorial. So when you first launch the Atlas page, there will be this splash screen that comes up that just sort of gives an overview of the data that went into it, acknowledging that while we did our best, we can't guarantee accuracy. So if you want to make sure you've got the most accurate information, obviously go to the actual jurisdiction's code. We hope this is has everything right, but we can't be perfect. After that splash screen, there's a few text boxes to sort of go through what the atlas is, how to use it, which I'm going to show you. And then you come to the map. And so when you see the map, it's the color coding on the map is broken down, as Jason mentioned, with the way we primarily coded these zoning districts. So the orange is the primary residential districts. So those districts are specifically for residential. There may be some incidental commercial, but it's primarily residential. The yellow is the mixed use. So that has a mixture of residential and commercial uses that are allowed. The burgundy purple color is the non-residential. So that could be commercial or industrial zoning districts, agricultural zoning districts, or primarily conservation zoning districts. And then the sort of grayish blue is what we call the non-buildable areas. So those are areas that are permanently protected and or areas of larger wetlands or water bodies, so 10 acres or more. So then if you interact with the atlas, if you click on anywhere on the atlas, you'll get this pop-up box. And if you're zoomed out at the state level or maybe at the county level, the first thing that you'll see is a pop-up about the jurisdiction that you clicked on. That will have a breakdown of things like the buildable area for the town, and of that buildable area, what percentage is primarily residential, how much is mixed use, how much is non-residential, and then a breakdown for the residential of these sort of 5 housing treatments: single family, duplex, 3-family, 4-family, or 5+. And then at the bottom of that pop-up are links to the zoning code, the subdivision regulations, site plan regulations that we used in the atlas. If you click the little arrows within that, you can then look at the zoning district, and I'll show you an example in a minute. And that gives a breakdown of all those things that Jason mentioned that are coded for that zoning district: density, setbacks, parking, ADU requirements, things like that. So for using the atlas, there's a few ways you can use it. In the top left of the map, you can zoom in and out with the plus and minus. You can use a scroll wheel mouse. You can do shift plus, shift minus, however you want to interact with it. Anytime you want to come back to the full extent, that little home button. You can search by jurisdiction. Start typing in a jurisdiction name. It should auto-populate. You can go to that jurisdiction in the state. Alternatively, you can search by an address. You can put in any address in the state. Again, it'll auto-populate as you start to type, select the one you want, and it'll zoom right to that spot. And then we have these series of toggles on the left. And so this is where sort of the fun is, where you get to interact with the atlas, see a few different things. The first 5 on the left are, you can do the different housing treatments that I mentioned. You can look at where a single family allowed, where a duplex is allowed, where a 5+ family allowed. Then we have some more specific types of housing, where detached ADUs allowed. Where are the districts that you can have multifamily if you make it age restricted, or where can you have multifamily if it's affordable housing? Then we get into manufactured housing. And so you can look at different ways that the zoning districts treat manufactured housing. Is it allowed within a manufactured housing park? Is it allowed on individual lots? Is it allowed in both? Is it allowed in neither? And then finally, the last set of toggles you can do is you can actually do some of your own sort of light analysis, if you will. You can look at acreages that are required for housing development. Where can you have small lot residential development? Where do municipalities require you to have a large lot in order to have development? And I'll show you how that works in a second. And then, so then at the bottom, you've gone through. So now you can, actually go to the viewer, and also there's a link back to that visual summary that I mentioned. So here's the atlas. So again, the little disclaimer, if you click this little box in the lower corner, and then say, okay, you hopefully won't have to see this disclaimer again, unless you're using a different computer. Again, here's the information. It explains what the non-buildable land is, how you interact with the atlas, how to use those interactive filter sliders on the left, and some links on how to get to additional data. So here's our atlas. So as I said, we can interact with it. Let's say we want to see where in the state are duplexes allowed, and we click that little slider, and the districts that don't allow duplexes at all go away. Again, as I said, the coding is based on the types of districts, so primary residential, mixed use, and non-residential. Similarly, let's say we want to look at where is 5+ family allowed in the state. We click that, we see a lot of the state disappears, and these are the areas where 5+ family is allowed. Detached ADUs, where which zoning districts allow detached ADUs. We click on that. Again, the state changes. Where are districts that you can only do multifamily if it's age restricted? And we click on that, and it automatically zooms to those districts in the state. And similarly, where can you do multifamily? There we go. If it's only for affordable housing, and again, it zooms in there. And then manufactured housing, this is an interesting one to sort of look at the different treatments. So this is showing where in the state is manufactured housing allowed in this district, whether it's within a park or on an individual lot. If I want to see where is it only in parks, this is the areas of the state where you can only do manufactured housing within manufactured housing parks. Where is it allowed on individual lots? Scattered throughout the state. These are districts that, within the code, it specifically says you can have manufactured housing on an individual lot. And then where is manufactured housing prohibited? Obviously, a lot of the non-residential districts, but also many of the residential districts as well, as you can see. And so one of the things, and these are some of the findings that we'll show in a little bit more detail that we wanted to look at is, what are some of the restrictions on housing, specifically due to lot sizes? So one thing we were looking at is, where can you have a small lot in the state of New Hampshire? And so if I do 0 to 1 acres for a single family home, these are the districts where you can have a house on a lot that's less than 1 acre. Not a lot of area, which my colleagues will discuss later. Sort of looking at it a different way, where are the areas in the state that require 4 acres or more to have a single family home? And you see there's quite a few districts in the state that you have to have at least 4 acres even to build a single family home. And believe it or not, we could go up to 20 acres. And there are areas in the state that require 20 acres in order to have a single family lot. So those are some of the ways, like I said, you can interact with this atlas. And just to show you a couple other things, like I said, if you want to search for a jurisdiction, I'll just put in Concord. That's easy. Come on. There we go. So it'll zoom to the jurisdiction in question. If you click on that jurisdiction, that just brought up the whole zoning district. the fun with live demonstrations is when the internet is bogging down. There we go. It's everyone at home that's trying this out as well, probably. So I click on Concord, I get information about the city. It's 55% of the zoning district are primary residential, 7% mixed use, and this is by land area, not total number of districts. And then 32% is considered non-developable. Again, that's permanently protected lands or lands that are water or wetlands. For the residential, 62% allows single family, 15% allows two family, and 8% allows 3, 4, or 5 family. And then, as I said, there's links if you want to go to the actual, code for that jurisdiction. There's the link to the zoning code, the subdivision regulations, site plan regulations. Again, where we have them, all of them should have a zoning code link. Most have these subdivision and site plan regs, and the dates listed. That's the most current available regulation. And then, like I said, hopefully this will work. We can type in an address. So I will see if we can get right here where we are. And so we zoom in. I'll just come over here a little bit. We'll zoom out a little bit. And so, we're at the college here, and it's it's a little slow to load. Come on, there we go. So this is the zoning district that we're in, town of Goffstown. It's called high density residential. Single family is allowed, 2 families allowed, 3, 4, and 5+ family are allowed with public hearing. You can look at, like I said, the lot size requirements. So what you see here, maybe a little small for some to see, but for instance, for 1 family minimum lot, it says just about half an acre. And so what we do is there's several districts that have sort of a sliding scale of available lot sizes based on access to water and sewer or quality of soils. And so when we report the 1 family lot size or 2 family lot size, that's the averaging of those possible range. So that sort of captures most of the district, what you could build. But then we also do include 1 family under ideal conditions. So access to water and sewer. So you see it drops down to 0.23 acres if you have water and sewer. Conversely, we have lot size under quote unquote worst case conditions. So if you don't have water and sewer, maybe you have poor soils, it's about 40,000 square feet. And then same thing for all the other density, 2 family, 3 family, 4 family, same types of things. There's 100 and something lines of data here that you can scroll through. There's, affordable housing treatments are in here, accessory and dwelling unit treatments, and then there'll be a note at the end for any sort of particular nuance to that code. And then another thing we can do is, if we're zoomed in, one thing that's nice is we can actually, click these sliders and compare, in real time, sort of what these things are. So if I'm looking at 5+ family, for instance, we could see sort of at the town boundaries how those changes affect. We could also, again, do the minimum acreage things and things like that. But just a way to sort of visually compare quickly, district to district, municipality to municipality. And with that, I will end the demo and turn it back over. Sure. Not prohibited and not allowed. Well, remember the gray area is non-developable. So if you're looking at that, so if you sort of aggregate these 3, the parks only, the both parks and individual lots, and the individual lots, and then the prohibited, it should be everything. Yes. It may not look it as it's going quickly, but yes, it should be everything. Yep, no problem. Okay, so I will turn it over to the team to go through our findings.
All right, thanks, Rick. And of course, there are many possible findings here. And we are just going to show you a few of them that we thought were of particular significance. So I'm going to start with the first two. Finding number one, this is about small lot, single family. So if you want to think about, say, a starter home, it's going to be very difficult to build an affordable starter home on an acre or more in the vast majority of the state. Maybe, you know, way up north where land is cheap, but certainly in the southern half of the state, that's going to be difficult to do. So, so we wanted to see where this is available. And part of the limitation here is the availability of utilities. But under state DES guidelines, you can build under certain soils, you can build a well and septic on a lot as little as 0.7 of an acre. All right, so we find here that 16% of the state's buildable land area is available for small lot, single family, defined as lots less than an acre with less than 200 feet of road frontage. So, and you see that actually the places where a lot of this land area lies are rural areas to the northwest. So small lot, single family homes are generally not widely available in the southern southeastern third of the state, but you do see Manchester, Nashua, I think that's Dover and Somersworth and Rochester tend to allow that over most of their land area, and I think Londonderry. Finding number two, a small lot two family. So here you see, just scrolling back, the differences between these, it's less, right? So less land area is available for small lot two family, and here we've defined small lot slightly differently. So again, it's lot under an acre, or if a maximum density is set more than 2 units per acre and less than 200 feet of road frontage. And so we find that 11% of the state's buildable land area is available for small lot two family. And again, the bulk of that acreage does seem to be in the more rural areas. And we find also there are 70 jurisdictions that don't allow two family by right anywhere within the jurisdiction. All right, and with that, I'll hand it over to Noah Hodges.
Thank you, Jason. So for finding number three, many of New Hampshire's communities, including those close to job markets, require large lots for multifamily housing, thereby driving up the cost of these homes and making them unaffordable to residents. So in this finding, in this map, we're particularly looking at 5+ family multifamily. That was on purpose, as that is how multifamily is defined in the state's workforce housing law. And we're also defining small lot a little bit differently than the prior slides. So whereas the first finding number one and finding number two that Jason showed, we were defining, we were looking at small lots as under an acre. Here we're looking at defining small lots as under 2.5 acres with less than 300 feet of frontage and with greater than 2 units per acre minimum density. And so what we find here is that, again, the same color shading of the orange is where small lot multifamily is allowed. The yellow is allowed with restrictions, so where it would be allowed only in where you might have to have a certain percentage have required affordable housing, workforce housing, or be age restricted. So what we find in grand total is that 21% of the state there's buildable allows small lot multifamily. Comparing that to the finding number 1 and 2, that's actually a larger percentage of buildable area. As Ben will detail in some later slides, we posit that may actually be as a result of the workforce housing law requiring communities to provide reasonable and realistic opportunities for workforce housing. As I said, we defining, again, workforce housing law defining multifamily as 5+ family units. Finding number 4, we did a deeper dive on Manchester and the 7 surrounding communities. And we did a actual parcel analysis of the region. And we found that once you include existing development in land use restrictions, once those are all taken into account, the percentage of by right buildable small lots shrinks from 21% down to 7.8%. So here, the gray areas that are, say, non-developable. So those are including, again, whereas the prior slide said non-buildable, we're now here referring to non-buildable, non-developable. Those are including both the permanently protected areas and the water and wetlands areas, as well as all the areas that are already built out, have development or built out per their current zoning. And so you see that Manchester, for example, is significantly built out, except for the couple of smidgen of orange areas where there may still be some opportunities to allow single family development in the purple areas where it'd be outright prohibited. Other communities surrounding Manchester, with a few exceptions, are largely based on their current zoning, do not allow small lot single family, again, with less than an acre of lot size and less than 200 feet of frontage. And so we, you could do the same exercise for the entire state. I think that we, in kind of later phases of this project, we probably will do that, where you underlay the parcels and actual building footprint data. And we probably find similar results where the buildable, I would expect we'd see the buildable area percentage shrink once you account for actual development. So finding number 5, we're specifically looking at ADUs. So under New Hampshire law, communities are required to allow attached ADUs, but the approval process is often time consuming and expensive. And in some communities, the requirements, as this map shows, the requirements for additional parking actually limits ADU development. So here we're seeing in this map, in orange, 42% of states or buildable area, ADUs are allowed by right and with less than 2 parking spaces. In the other areas, so in the yellow areas, which is a significant, I don't have the exact percentage, but obviously a significant amount of the land area in the state, are requiring 2 spaces and or a public hearing with less than 3 spaces. So the public hearing could be required through a special exception or a conditional use permit, which the statute allows, and at least 2 parking spaces up to, or just 2, anywhere from 2 up to less than 3. And then the purple or, the magenta areas are actually requiring 3 to 4 parking spaces for a single ADU, which, is thinking about a single ADU being the statute having the 700-foot requirement, that these are small living units intended for 1-2 people. The fact that there's a handful of communities that are requiring 3 to 4 spaces, I think that speaks for itself. And then finally, there's the brown areas are where they're prohibited, and again, the gray areas are the non-buildable, non-developable land. Now I'm gonna turn it over to to Sarah to talk about finding number 6.
Thanks, Noah. So much like ADUs, New Hampshire law also requires communities to allow for manufactured homes in residential areas. And we looked at this specifically because manufactured homes are one of the few affordable, naturally occurring home ownership options in the state of New Hampshire. And I think that's incredibly important because a lot of times when we talk about affordable housing, we're talking about rental. And the ability to have home ownership is the ability to build wealth and to fully contribute back into the economy. So when we looked at manufactured housing, the area in orange shows the same standard as before, less than 1 acre and 200 feet of frontage, where manufactured housing is allowed on a small lot and where it would be allowed in a park on smaller lots. And it's less than 10% of the land in the state of New Hampshire. The area in yellow shows you small lots only, where manufactured housing parks aren't allowed. And the area in brown shows parks only, but most of these would be 2 acres or more per unit. So the actual viability of building a manufactured housing park decreases with the larger lot size. And again, the purple, the vast majority of the map shows this as prohibited housing for an affordable housing type. And with that, I'm going to turn it, or I'll stay, but Ben's going to join me up here.
Thanks, Sarah. I want to take a moment to try to answer that question. Well, why'd you do this? Any good story has an arc. The energetic, hopeful beginning, the pit of despair, and then you rise to what we hope is the triumphant ending. That gives you a sense of the stories I like and the movies I like to watch. And that's kind of the how, led by our champion, sword drawn Max Latona. But why? Because zoning matters. Zoning impacts people. It impacts people's property and their rights, value of property. It affects their lives. It affects, obviously, how our communities develop. That's its purpose, right? It also has statewide implications. Zoning impacts in aggregate how our state develops, how our economy performs, whether we can provide sufficient homes for people. The zoning atlas helps answer this question about the impact of zoning on our lives and our economy. But it is, and I'll echo what Max said earlier, it is a policy neutral tool. It doesn't itself have an agenda. It helps to answer these questions. What do people need to know about zoning? And it allows for comparisons between and among communities, and looks at the aggregate impact, potentially, of zoning throughout the state. And finally, it looks at this question: what's the impact of zoning on housing production? Think back 100 years ago to the original purpose of zoning. Zoning was created by states following a federal model, and it's really intended to protect public health, safety, and welfare. And you'll find those words in New Hampshire's zoning enabling statute and probably every state zoning enabling statute. It was intended to keep the right things, something we want, from the wrong places, or to use the colorful language of the United States Supreme Court, to keep the pig out of the parlor. But zoning has changed over time. Its purpose has changed. And here in New Hampshire, and as we've seen elsewhere as well, in response to the building booms of the 1970s and the 1980s, many communities responded to adopt restrictive zoning policies to limit development, particularly housing development, and to limit or prohibit just about any kind of housing development except for single-family homes on large lots. And we are left with that legacy today. So state law matters. New Hampshire is not a home rule state. Anything that a municipality, anything that a city or town wants to do, it has to look to an enactment of the legislature, granting it the power to do so. And that means the legislature can and does say how to use that power, recognizing that some municipalities will only do the bare minimum to meet any statutory requirement, regardless of what the outcome might be. Now we see these limitations on the power of zoning enacted by the legislature in a couple of examples that we've already talked about. The accessory dwelling unit law established by the legislature in 2016 is a limitation on how municipalities can use zoning. And many people and many municipalities use that law's flexibility, the inherent flexibility, to make accessory dwelling unit development very difficult or almost impossible. And you saw the map that Noah showed, the parking requirements in some communities. And there are others too. The workforce housing law enacted by the legislature in 2008 is another limitation on how municipalities can use zoning. And it says, among many other things, that municipalities must allow in some place 5+ unit structures. So at least 5 units in a structure that is affordable. As a result, and Noah talked about this too, as a result, in some communities, it's actually easier to develop a 5-plex than it is a duplex. And that just defies logic, but that is the outcome of the law.
And community decisions matter. Zoning here in New Hampshire, because the state law has delegated to the towns, it is inherently local and it's importantly local. And many communities are already doing great work and have had really hard conversations about their contributions to housing and the housing crisis. We have some right now. Newmarket just had some really hard conversations about allowing for detached accessory dwelling units. And Manchester is having some great conversations right now about how they're addressing the housing challenges and looking at pieces of their zoning to make changes. This database, this tool allows communities to be able to have resources at their fingertips for free to make comparisons and to see and have real data and not just assumptions when they're having these hard conversations that will continue to happen over the years ahead. And hopefully with these tools will allow them to have a lot more data to base those conversations on. So the Atlas allows you to compare and contrast communities, right? In my small town, I don't necessarily want to compare myself to Nashua or to Manchester, but I can look at other small communities across the state, and I can also see neighborhoods across the state and be like, you know what, I really love when I drive through that neighborhood. They seem to have more housing there or whatever, but I can see that, and I could zoom to this on this map and see what does that zoning say and how does that form follow function to some extent. And the Atlas really offers a view of zoning at a comprehensive level. So many towns and the hard work and those hard conversations by change makers and policy leaders there are having conversations about accessory dwelling units in one piece, right? Or just about how are we looking at elderly housing. And this tool allows you to look across the zoning and see those impacts in a holistic view in a way that most communities haven't had the opportunity to do before.
So there's room for change. Why did we choose housing as a focus? Well, New Hampshire Housing just published a statewide housing needs assessment that shows that we have a current shortage of over 23,500 units statewide. That's just to meet current demand to restore some stability to the market. It does not account for future growth and the need for additional housing development to accommodate future growth. Bottom line is we need more housing production. This doesn't mean that any community needs to be flooded with housing, but we do need to see modest increases in housing production overall throughout the state, community by community. We also recognize that in many cases, local zoning barriers do impede economic growth in the state, in individual communities, in our regions, and statewide. Without affordable places to live, new employees and employers will look elsewhere. The Zoning Atlas helps to show how zoning can be changed to be more welcoming to housing. Turn it back to Max.
Oh, there's not a seat there. Yeah, thank you, Ben, and to the whole leadership team. I just want people to realize that that they put an enormous amount of work into this project. So for roughly 16 months, we've been meeting every week at 8 a.m. on Friday morning to keep this project going. And then even the last 2 months, we've been meeting twice a week at 8 a.m. Tuesday morning and Friday morning. So an enormous amount of time. I may be waving the sword, but then I kind of step back and let them charge ahead. And they've done great work with that, with all of the work they've done. So I guess we have time for questions here. So I'm going to give this microphone to the team, and then depending on the question, we can rotate the microphone around. So yes.
Thanks. I was just thinking about what Sarah said about looking at the map and saying, oh, I like that neighborhood. let's go see what their code says. Is there any way in the atlas to see whether that neighborhood was built before the current code? I know, I'm fourplex Ivy fan and I'm happy to be here.
Thank you, Ivy. Yeah, what's the?
Thank you so much for the question. So we, right now in the current version of the code, in the current version of the atlas, there is not a way to do an analysis of looking at kind of overlaying the zoning atlas layers and comparing to the year built of buildings to seeing, does the zoning predate or post-date the buildings, the actual on the ground. It is our hope, and kind of now that the atlas is public, to do additional analysis to be able to show, especially kind of the point of, we have these great historic village and town centers and downtowns throughout the state that we all cherish, and I think we all want to keep. But I think, as we know anecdotally, the zoning in many of those cases, or those building development patterns predate the zoning. So our hope is to be able to do an additional analysis down the line, which would actually confirm that. We do not have that today.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing you can do is what we did in the Manchester area, where you merge the zoning layer with data on structures, so you can see whether the zoning is for the same density as currently exists, and so nothing more can be built, or even less. So in my town, there's a historic district where the built density is about 4 units per acre, but the zone density is about half a unit per acre. So you can see that, and those are kind of instructive cases where you know for certain that was built before the zoning.
Other questions? Yes, there's a microphone coming.
So this relates to the last comments made. So to get a feel for what the shortage of 23,500 means, about how many units are there currently? In other words, what percentage increase would that be?
Good question. Ben, do you want to tackle that?
That's a great question. I'm just drawing off of memory, and Rob might be able to help me here. I think there's something like 500 or 600,000 units in the state. So it's not a huge increase in the number of housing units, and nor is it specific to what types of units are needed. And I encourage you to go to New Hampshire Housing's website, nhhfa.org or nhhousing.org, either one, and look for our statewide housing needs assessment. There's an 8-page executive summary, which is probably sufficient for most people. There's also the full 250-page report, which goes into great detail. But as I said in my comments earlier, this is a very modest increase in the number of homes that we need to meet current demand. The report also indicates that we need in total an additional 60,000 units by 2030 and roughly 90,000 total units by 2040 to meet projected population growth.
Great, thanks, Ben. Other questions or comments? Yes, we have another one here. If you could state your name too.
Yeah, Joe Sweeney. I'm from Salem. Has there been any additional analysis beyond the zoning barriers that are in place on impact fees, betterment fees, other fees on development that are providing an additional barrier to the housing supply or any real mixed use supply that we have?
Thank you. Not at this time. This is really just focused on zoning, and the zoning atlas is a first step, and we truly see it as a layer cake, right? And it's helping to really understand something that hasn't been readily available to look at in this way before. So no, there isn't that yet, but it's certainly one of the future potential steps.
Noah, do you want to mention the municipal survey for those who don't know?
Thank you. I appreciate that. So my office, the New Hampshire Office of Planning and Development within the Department of Business and Economic Affairs, BEA, we also maintain an annual municipal land use regulation survey, which is a kind of higher 20,000 foot level. We don't collect data on you know, do you have an impact fee for fire versus police versus school? But we do at least have a list of what communities are implementing impact fees. And you can find that at our new website, nhopd.com.
Great. Other questions? There's one here.
We do have a question online, if we don't mind taking that quickly.
Sure.
We have a couple people wondering how the atlas will be kept up to date.
Great question. Jason, you want to take that?
Yeah, so we're going to do this funding permitting either every year or every other year. And we'll maintain that consistent time series. As Rick mentioned, we will archive the 2022 and every year going forward that we do this, because we want researchers to then be able to say, okay, I want to investigate the effects of zoning changes, and that will be possible with our data.
I can say we've had some quiet conversations in the last day or two about this, and we plan to do updates this summer to the Atlas. So we already have some interns that are interested. We just have to make sure we have the funding, but we plan to do that. So, and as Jason mentioned, we plan to do that regularly from here on out, so the data doesn't get stale. Another question here?
Maybe this seemed kind of obvious, but my question is about whether the local areas, like the regional areas, if they know that they can send it directly to you, or do you have to go and seek it out from them?
Are you talking, referring to data? So you're talking
Yeah.
about zoning changes?
Yes.
Oh, yes.
They can,
go
yeah,
ahead.
they can send it to us, zoning atlas@anselm.edu, but if they don't, we'll go find it.
Yeah.
But please send if you have it.
Good. Another question.
Hi, Sarah Smith. My son used the Connecticut zoning atlas to do some research for his graduate project. And I was wondering if the New Hampshire atlas will be available for other researchers to, examine some of these questions that people are asking.
Oh, great question. And the answer is yes. We are making all of our data publicly available as of now. So any researchers who want to use the spreadsheets, and Jason, do you want to just talk a little bit about what different types of data are available?
Sure, and Rick can supplement this as well. So we do have, first of all, there's a Google sheet that has all the information on every zoning district in the state, and that's what the interns actually worked with in entering the data. That includes districts that are not mapped. So these would be overlay districts that may depend on the presence of wetland vegetation defines where the wetland district lies. Well, so it's not officially mapped on the zoning map. And so we don't include it obviously in our map, but we do have those data available within that sheet. And it also has sort of text descriptions of complex regulations, right? So if it's something about, oh, there's a different frontage on a corner lot versus a non-corner lot, something like that, it might just have a text describing that regulation. Then we have what interfaces with the interactive atlas is a CSV file, comma separated values file, where we've interpreted all those complex regulations as a quantitative code. So a statistical researcher can just go in there and analyze the data and find, like, what's the average minimum lot size? What is the weighted average by land area or whatever. And that also allows us to do the filters on the interactive atlas. So we can say, minimum lot size between 0 and 1 acre. Obviously, we couldn't do that if some of the cells were just a text description. So you have both of those, and so you can grab both of those. And then there are also some GIS assets you can get, which are, you can get what the zoning districts themselves, as well as with the data.
Yes, so the GIS files that are available, the layer that you saw us interacting with is on there. It's all the buildable areas of the districts that include all the attributes already populated. There's actually two versions. There's a version you saw online, which has been smoothed a little bit for faster viewing online, but we actually also have a sort of what I'll call a full resolution data set that follows every last little curve of water bodies and zoning district lines for those that want to use desktop analysis to get a little more accurate acreage values and things like that. And that you have the ability to look at just the buildable area or the entire district without the buildable area clipped out.
You know, and I will add to that, that our leadership team has discussed ongoing research with the project. So even here at home, we're going to continue to put more work into the atlas, researching the data, drawing out content and findings going forward. So but we welcome anybody else to take a look at the data and draw their own conclusions and findings and share that with the public. So good question. We have another question in the back. We have time for maybe one or two more.
Thank you. This is an invaluable tool, and I applaud the efforts that all has gone into it. It focuses on zoning, which is something we can get our arms around. Going up above that for a moment, where are there other opportunities for improving the production of housing in our state? And there are a couple of examples. One of them is the presence of water and sewer in a community is a factor. It's significant because our soils aren't all that great to deal with for private septic. And it's expensive, and we have health safety codes for an obvious reason. So what can we do in that regard, perhaps? I know this is beyond the scope here, but I'm just going a little bit higher. Another thought was perhaps architectural building codes. Are there opportunities for encouraging and reducing the cost of housing with architectural codes? I know, for example, in Massachusetts, they made it possible to build taller structures out of wood frame and not requiring steel, and sprinklers and all the other codes that I only know a little bit about.
Great comments. So we've talked about that first one at length. I'll let somebody address that.
I think there's a lot of options. Two quick off the top of my head would be, I think that there's been incredible improvements in septic system technology that maybe we are in the process of beginning to understand. We have actually used quite a bit of them in our lakes regions and close to water bodies where we have smaller lots already, but it's a one-off, it's a specialty thing, which takes extra time, extra approvals, and extra costs. So I think that there's some significant work that I believe is already underway as well to look at the modern technology around septic systems that are safe and would protect our biggest asset, which is our water quality, right? And I also think that there are tremendous updates in the building codes that are moving forward with new technologies as well, engineered wood, and you can build a bit taller here with wood frame as well, but it's keeping up with the building codes. And that's incredibly important to be able to adopt those new technologies, because if you don't have new technologies, if you want to use a new technology, you have to get separate engineering stamps for every piece of new technology, which is $1,000 as a minimum every time you want to do that. So doing that on a one-off basis certainly is very expensive versus keeping up with codes that allow for those new technologies already.
There are also some important legislative initiatives right now this year in this session that all seem to be converging on the budget and what ultimately will be negotiations between the House and the Senate. The Senate has the budget and is considering a number of Senate-passed bills to put into the budget, including the establishment of a Housing Champions Designation Program, which NOAA's office would administer if it were passed. And that would provide tools and grant funding for municipalities, one, to achieve a certain level of housing friendliness. And then once having achieved that and been designated as a housing champion community, then be eligible for additional grant funding for per unit production, which is very similar to the current Invest NH, our per unit production program, and also additional funding for water and sewer development and other types of municipal infrastructure. So these are really important initiatives. Beyond that, there's also funding for housing development that the legislature is considering. And the legislature is also considering the establishment of an historic housing preservation tax credit. So this would be similar, but a lot simpler than the federal historic preservation tax credit, and would be focused exclusively on housing. So this is an important initiative to help utilize our existing structures to create new housing units in them.
Great. I think we're running a little short on time here. I see some other hands, but let's hold them until after the next segment, which is the final segment, our panel discussion, and there'll be an opportunity for Q&A there. So I want to thank our leadership team for their work on this project and their presentation, and we're going to introduce the panelists now. Okay, so for this next segment, it's our panel discussion. We invited some community leaders, prominent leaders of our communities who have dealt closely with the issue of housing or zoning in one form or another, to come and just share their reactions about the Atlas, some thoughts that they have. So let me see here. What's going on? Okay, so first I'm going to invite to the stage Dick Anagnost. Dick Anagnost is the president of Anagnost Investments and Company Incorporated, which is the umbrella company of 14 operating businesses with a primary thrust in real estate development. His company is one of the largest for-profit developers for both workforce and market rate housing in the state of New Hampshire. Anagnost Investments has been in developing housing in New Hampshire for 44 years. So welcome and thank you for coming, Dick. You just want to make clear. On, good. Second, Sylvia Von Aulich. Sylvia has worked for multiple local, regional, and state agencies for over 35 years. She holds a bachelor's in civil engineering and a master's in landscape architecture. Sylvia has been with Southern New Hampshire Planning Commission since June 2015 and became executive director in June 2017. Since 2016, much of her work has focused on creating opportunities to develop age-friendly communities in the region and beyond. Sylvia guides the commission staff to ensure partnering communities and agencies receive quality land use and transportation planning assistance. So welcome and thank you for joining us, Sylvia. Third, Margaret Burns. Margaret has served as executive director of the New Hampshire Municipal Association since 2019. She joined the NHMA in 2014 as a staff attorney. Previously, she was an associate attorney with a firm in Manchester and an adjunct professor of legal research and writing at Northeastern University School of Law, Suffolk Law School, and the Massachusetts School of Law. Margaret has an MBA from the University of New Hampshire Paul School of Business, a JD from the Massachusetts School of Law, and I love this part, a BA in English Language and Literature and Classical Languages from Smith College, and volunteers as a CASA, a guardian ad litem for CASA of New Hampshire. Welcome, Margaret, and thank you for joining us. And our fearless moderator, Nick Taylor is the executive director of the Workforce Housing Coalition of the Greater Seacoast. Prior to serving as executive director, Nick worked on a range of public policy and advocacy initiatives and served as a policy director in the New Hampshire State Senate. Nick currently serves on the Governing Council of Housing Action New Hampshire, on the board of directors of the Cooperative Alliance for Seacoast Transportation, and I love this, as an alternate member of the Manchester Zoning Board of Adjustments. So welcome, Nick, and thank you for joining us as moderator.
Thank you, man.
I'm going to turn it over to all of you. Just make sure your lav mics are on. If you could.
Thank you, Max. Thank you to the center for having us. Thank you for the leadership team and everyone that worked on this project. You know, I think we're all really excited to use it, to talk about it. It's going to make such a difference here today. So we've got a great group of panelists. We'll be able to get right into it. I have a few questions to kick us off, and then we'll turn it over to audience questions for folks on Zoom. You can drop your questions right into the chat there, and we'll be able to take a couple of those as well. So let's start big picture here. You know, you each bring a different perspective to this conversation. I think we all agree that this is going to be an incredible tool. But what impact do you think this tool and this data being available will have on your line of work or in the communities that you work with? And Margaret, we start with you here.
Sure. Is my mic on? Can you hear me? Okay, excellent. Well, thank you for having us. Thank you for inviting the New Hampshire Municipal Association to be part of this conversation. the tool, the zoning atlas is an incredible effort, an incredible piece of work that is going to be a critical resource, I think, for cities and towns, local officials, as well as residents of the state. One of the things that local officials need and want are more resources to help them do their jobs. And this tool sort of reminds me of a somewhat similar resource that allows municipalities to compare budgets and spending among municipalities, so they can look at their own budget in an interactive tool, and then they can pull up budgets of similarly sized municipalities. They can compare what those similarly sized municipalities are spending on police, on welfare, and they can sort of try to gauge where they are budget wise and look big picture at the state as well. And this tool reminds me of that. It's going to allow local officials to look at what's going on in their community, to compare what's happening in other communities, and consider what changes they would like to make, and how they might go about doing that. And even to know other municipalities to reach out to and communicate, which is something that NHMA encourages, sort of working together and looking at what other cities and towns are doing, to consider regional or collaborative efforts. I also just have to say that seeing the student engagement to make this project happen, one of the things that cities and towns struggle so much with is the engagement of citizens. And that is part of this discussion, right? Because in New Hampshire, most of our municipalities adopt zoning and other ordinances through town meeting, which means you must have the voters to buy into what you're putting forward, and you must have voter education and buy-in to pass changes to any local ordinances and laws. And so seeing young people being engaged and being interested in what happens on the local level, and interested in change at the local level, we need more momentum there, in all age groups, but it's particularly important to see that in younger people. So I think that's a huge bonus to this entire project.
Sylvia.
All right, testing. Yeah, I am on. That sounded really good, and I'm afraid now. So, thank you, Noah, for laughing. So I'll take it at the regional perspective, since that's kind of my hat at the moment. Ben mentioned the statewide regional housing needs assessment that has just been completed. For those of you who don't know, there are 9 regional planning commissions in the state. I represent just one of them today, never mind. Anyway, I can't even say it. And at that regional, we have just completed our regional housing needs assessment. I find that this would be a perfect companion to those regional housing needs assessments, so that we can look at the data. But really, just as Margaret was saying, that this is just going to continue the conversation, whether they're folks out in the audience here present or on Zoom, or later on down the line as they discover this tool, that they may say, wait a minute, I'm not sure about the results. I'm not sure that it really requires 3 parking or 4 parking spots for manufactured housing. But you know what that does? That those questions in people's minds, it makes them look into it. The young people that are involved, those people that are on land use boards right now, we need to talk about this. We know that for many, housing is a 4-letter word. They don't want to talk about it. They don't want housing. And then on the other hand, there are those who are finding that there are no options for them, whether it's a young person coming out of school or an older adult looking to downsize and just wanting to stay in their community. These tools will help that conversation to continue. And I think that's really the key. Dick.
So from a private developer's point of view, well, let me take a step back. My first contact with the Atlas was when it first began, and Max and the students invited me for a free lunch, which naturally I accepted. And that lunch, I allotted 1 hour and it ended up being over 3. And having done this for 40 years, this is what they've achieved here is akin to the 13th labor of Hercules. Okay, I have a lot of this data in my office because I've developed in a significant number of communities in New Hampshire. But to put it together in an organized form in which it's presented as it is today, is just beyond my belief. I mean, each time I look at this, I'm more and more astounded at what they've achieved. Never mind what they've achieved on a low budget. They've achieved with no prior experience in the development world. Okay, so my hat's really off to what they've accomplished. From a personal standpoint, though, I'll make 3 quick observations, if I may. First, I must have been mentally ill when I started down the path of being a real estate developer on housing in New Hampshire. The second one is, after having my finger in the pie of close to 5,000 residential units, you could see how much my illness has progressed. And thirdly, to be able to go forward with a tool like this, where I can find 21 municipalities that don't, or just jurisdictions that don't have zoning, I need to go directly to that portion of the atlas first. But aside from that, I echo what my esteemed colleagues, who are much more prolific at speaking than I am, have stated. But more importantly, from a private standpoint, you now have the ability to pick and choose where you want to go depending upon what you're developing. There's still a long way to go. For instance, we now have the raw data, but how that data is interpreted is still up for grabs. You do a mixed use development in the same community. 2 of them actually. One, the planners gave us a density calculation of, you take out the footprint of the commercial and you use the rest of the land. And after, when we went to do the second one, our density was significantly reduced because the new interpretation was, you take out the footprint, the parking lots, and any curtilage surrounding the commercial, so therefore reduce the density. But we're our own worst enemy. We talked about water and sewer. We talked about all these things. We talked about the 4-letter word. So for all you prolific spellers out there, density is really spelled with 4 letters when you get to the approval process. We don't do planning, as Ben pointed out. It's a knee-jerk reaction, and this tool shows you what a knee-jerk reaction it has been. I had a perfect piece of land, 10 acres in size. In New Hampshire, it's perfect because it didn't have wetlands, it didn't have ledge. Okay, it was zoned appropriately, it had full utilities, and we laid out a project of 24 units per acre, and they allowed us 9 because that's what the zoning regulation says. Okay, we don't use our land to the maximum, we actually inhibit our ability to develop. And this tool, as I was playing with it, shows that blatantly we don't do planning, and blatantly that we don't maximize the resources at our disposal in order to achieve our housing crisis. So it's a really valuable tool. It does need to be updated regularly because every town meeting, as it's been pointed out, there's a new zoning regulation that goes on. The businesses become more complicated. And in closing, I can tell you that none of the students that worked in this will ever pursue real estate development as a career path.
Thank you all. I like going at the end because we're able to just comment on what the smart folks ahead of us had put up as some of the big takeaways here. So, getting to those specific takeaways. As we were listening to this presentation today, as you were playing around with the Atlas ahead of this, what stood out to you? Were there any surprises, or was there anything that really jumped out in these sort of specific takeaways about the findings here? And Sylvia, why don't we start with you?
Ooh. Yeah, several things. One, it was said earlier on, I think it was Max said, zoning is complex. I used to sit with, in Exeter in the planning office with the building inspector, with our secretary, who was of course the office everything and knew everything and all the history about every case. And we would discuss the cases of the week, the cases of the day, and we would go back and forth for an hour about the zoning and what would the allowances be. So my first thought was, how would a group of interns who never talked about zoning in their life, how would they look at this for the first time and, look at how were they categorized and measured and all those things? That was my first thought and question. The second thing was in the maps and the findings was often, so in this case, it's less than an acre and less than 200 feet frontage, where we know often it's 1 acre or 200 feet frontage. So I've already talked to Noah about that. And I think like anything, any mechanical thing, you're going to kick the tires and you're going to look under the hood and you're going to find those nuances, because there are a lot of nuances in zoning. And I think this first year for all of us, it's going to be, how can we make this even a better tool and a more useful tool than it already is? So I think those are the things that I thought of immediately. But the other one is, aside from being complex, there are the sort of, how do you measure the nuances in zoning? For example, the attitudes and how they're interpreted again. And so, for example, some allowances, and I'm not sure that are built in, can be built into this, but I challenge the group and the interns that, like, for example, conditional use permits. How many communities have that sort of allowance? And I think for a developer, it would be very interesting to know what communities actually allow for some flexibility into zoning, because I think we need to know that. And I'd love to see communities adopt flexibility within zoning as well.
The biggest thing that actually shocked me was, and after doing this for 40 years, was the actual number of impediments that we currently have that prevent us from solving our own problem. I mean, this has really brought to light how bad off we really are as a result of our own knee-jerk reactions to things that were going on in our individual communities. And Sylvia hasn't launched into this yet, but there are two kinds of people out there. There's the silent majority that favors solving the problem, who whispers it to you in the coffee shop, hey, I love your project, please continue. And then there is the NIMBY component, okay, which is the loud minority that attends every meeting and prevents this from going forward. I mean, I invited Max to assist me at the very beginning of this project by attending a ZBA meeting on one of my projects. And the people that were standing up were not the abutters that had standing, it was the other townspeople. And what they were objecting most to was the fact that the town had adopted a workforce ordinance that required 25% of my project to be workforce housing. And it got so heated that Max asked to testify, and they denied him from testifying in the ZBA hearing as a result of what was going on. So they weren't really objecting to my project, they were objecting to their own ordinance that required 25% workforce housing. And like I said, it wasn't the silent majority, it was the vocal minority. But what this atlas has done for me is it's pointed out to 3 methods by which to solve our problem. One of them is public and active engagement by the majority. Okay, the majority elects our senators and our House representatives. They've got to hear that we need housing and we need the flexibility to put in this housing. And if all zoning originates at the state level, then you need to get something before our legislature that says, if you're not going to do this, then the state's going to do it for you, which goes against home rule, but we need to take some drastic action to solve our problems. The second one is, and Sylvia and our other esteemed panel members are members of this community, is we need to do planning. If we don't do planning, we do knee-jerk reactions. Our school is overcrowded, so we can't have kids, therefore we can't have any more housing. So therefore that's our current planning standard. Okay, if we looked at each one of these municipalities and said, there's water and sewer here, there's some pretty good land here, it's adjacent to other resources that they need, like shopping and stuff. Let's make this multifamily zone. Okay, and then New Hampshire is known for our preservationists and conservationists. I mean, how much preservation and conservation are you doing when I got to build 5 miles of road to put in 100 houses? Okay, when I could cluster them all on the first 5 acres and keep pristine open another 100 acres that I'm now going to run electric underground and utility poles and roadways through and drainage ditches through. That's not conservation or preservation. And then thirdly, and Most importantly, I've lost my train of thought. But one was planning, the other one is the four-letter word. So density. Okay, the government will never solve the housing crisis on its own. There's not enough money. We can't pay enough taxes. We can't bring enough resources. You have to look to private development. The only way that private development can drive down the cost of housing is through density. There's no other option. Okay. I gave you the example of the parcel of land, 10 acres. It was a unicorn. Okay. We could build 240 units and it would probably load over 300. Okay. And we got 90. Okay. We squandered the opportunity to attack our housing problem with an appropriate location, with everything necessary to do it, by a rule that was created that said we didn't want a lot of units because we didn't want school children, that drove the value of that property down to only 90 units versus 240 or 300 that the land would load. Okay, and this tool actually tells you in very clear, plain English that that's one of the major problems that we have.
So many things I want to say. I want to touch on a couple things that you mentioned, although I know the question is key takeaways from the zoning atlas. You mentioned the vocal minority being the people to come out and to sort of end up crafting and influencing the outcomes of votes. And that really goes back to something that local officials struggle with, is getting the real representative community to come out and be part of the voice and the vote that ultimately votes on zoning, or ultimately is what is acted upon when an application is before a planning board or a zoning board. And this is across the board, right? It's not just about zoning. I mean, local officials will put forward a proposal to build a new public safety building and tell their voters, ours is crumbling, you have to approve this, or, you know, the school needs upgrades for safety and security and you have to approve this, or our kids aren't safe in the facility that they're in. And voters routinely vote down projects like that. And it is in major part based on the fact that we fund local budgets through property taxes, and that system has an impact on what voters are willing to vote yes on and what they're willing to adopt. And so being able to educate voters on the benefits, the community benefits of making some of these changes that may have a stigma as being negative for their communities is a really big part of this. You mentioned as well that the government can't solve the housing crisis alone and that the private sector has to be part of this. And that is 100% true. I'll say something that may or may not be popular in this room, and that is that the private sector cannot solve that alone. Government is a huge piece of helping to solve any kind of public health or public related crisis. That is the purpose of government. And we talk a lot about potential state mandates to require municipalities to do certain things or require them to change their zoning in certain ways. But we don't talk a lot about more authority for municipalities to require more things, like to require a certain percentage of a housing development to be affordable housing, or to have additional requirements that can actually require affordable housing or other things to be part of a development. So I put out there the idea as well of more authority for municipalities and local officials when it comes to zoning and housing and things along those lines. As far as my key takeaways from the zoning atlas, one thing that I was not aware of was the number of municipalities that did not have zoning. If you had asked me before the zoning atlas, I probably would have said 5 or 6. I didn't realize it was as high as it was. So it's great to have that kind of data. But another takeaway that is not completely related to the conversation we're having here this morning is the amount of non-buildable land. To see, to know there's a lot of it, and that there's, the preserved areas, but to actually see it on the map and to see it take such a big chunk of sort of the center of the state farther north, and to understand what it means for those communities. I know that, for example, a town like the town of Albany has often voiced that a big percentage of their land is not for development. It's not for housing. It's not for commercial development. It's the White Mountain National Forest, right? And they've talked a lot about what that means for their community as well as their property taxpayers, because they do not have a big tax base. And since property taxes fund local budgets, that is a huge impact for them, especially being a beautiful town that helps to support the tourism that makes our state great and that brings in revenue for the state to allow the state to function. And so that was something that was really noticeable to me when I saw it on the map.
Thank you all. So now we'll turn it over to the audience questions. We'll have the mics coming around again. And again, for folks on Zoom, if you want to drop anything into the chat, we'll be looking for you as well here. So anyone who's got questions for our panelists, feel free to raise your hand.
Hi, this is Ethan DeWitt. I'm with the New Hampshire Bulletin. I had a devil's advocate question for everybody up here. So Margaret, you talked a little bit about how this can help communities see inspiration from other communities to try to improve their zoning codes. What about communities that look at this map and say, these restrictions look good, we should do more of that, and we should be more in line with our neighbors, and now we have a tool to figure out the best ways to make our neighborhoods look the way we want them. Has anybody given any thought to how to address that use of this atlas? Thanks.
That has not, Ethan, that has not crossed my mind as something that communities will be looking to do. I think that we've talked a lot about sort of how local officials and communities are under-resourced. We've talked about how most of them don't have full planning departments and full-time planners who are able to not only deal with the zoning issues before them today, but also to plan ahead, right? Because it's called planning and zoning. And so there's an aspect of this that's not just about enacting regulations, it's also about planning ahead and trying to figure out what you want your community to build out to or look like in the future. Most municipalities are faced with not enough people and not enough staff to help them with the realities of complex zoning and to make updates to their zoning ordinances. So I don't see the map being used that way. I think it will be used to help them look at their zoning ordinances and look at other municipal zoning ordinances. And one of the reasons I believe that is because the HOP grants, the grants that have been made available by the state of New Hampshire to provide direct grant funding to municipalities to hire a consultant, to do an in-depth look at their zoning ordinances and to consider updates to their zoning ordinances. They've been popular and municipalities have applied for them, and I think almost 50 have received them. So knowing, my membership and having worked with municipal officials for almost a decade, there is a hunger to learn more, understand better, and to get better resources to help them make positive changes.
If I may, I love that question. When they first unveiled this and we first looked at it, my director of real estate development rushed into my office and said, "We're dead. We're out of business. They're going to use this against us because they're going to implement even more zoning regulations to prevent us from going forward." So that was a really astute question, because that's the first thing from a private development standpoint that went through my entire staff like a cold knife go through cake. I mean, literally, they all walked in and said they're going to use this against us. But being the ultimate optimist, I'm hoping that the opposite point of view is taken, and that is that this is a good tool to show where we need to make progress. Okay, but that is dead on with exactly what my team felt when they first saw this tool.
And if I might, so I think your question is also about what are the next steps with this tool? We of course don't know. Every community will react a little differently. And as Dick mentioned, I get on a soapbox about how we seem to be at such polar opposites when we talk to people about housing. There are those who are like, I love my community the way it is. I want to build a wall, the moat, bring in the alligators, and no more building because I just bought my home and I like it the way it is. This is where we draw the line now that I've just moved here. And then there are those who say to you, I love my community. I've lived here for my whole life. I've raised my family here. They also love the community character, just like the first example. And yet their adult child has no choices on where to live. They cannot move in that same community. So they have to leave. They may even need to leave New Hampshire. And look at what we lose by doing that. So what are the next steps? It may be that some communities build the wall, but there may be others that have noticed during the pandemic the wanted signs in the nearby restaurant. Maybe their favorite restaurant has already gone out of business. So maybe how we're going to use this, and what I'm promoting during our sort of laying out the regional housing needs assessment, and now we'll use this tool, is to say to communities, whether you are on the moat side or the open to let's build more housing side, let's support our businesses in our communities and find places where we can build housing where there are also businesses. So let's look at those non-residential zones and how we can incorporate housing in the non-residential zones where people aren't going to come out and scream, "Don't you dare, Dick, come out and build that because I'm in the not in my backyard camp," but because it's in a non-residential area, but where the businesses are, they'll be, yes, in my backyard because it's not in my backyard. It's in the business backyard, and now it doesn't affect them. So I think we can use this tool in ways that we didn't imagine, and maybe looking at where are the non-residential areas where we can put multifamily right on the same lot as the business is. So now the commute is a walking commute where they can now make it a walkable community. Anyway, I can go on.
Real time though, village concept. I mean, Londonderry, we're doing a project right now, 300 apartments, 280,000 feet of industrial, 20,000 feet of commercial, a 10,000-foot daycare for an employer who's going to bring 1,200 jobs. That he's willing to provide his housing for his employees. He's willing to provide daycare for his employees. He's willing to provide neighborhood retail, the gym, the hairdresser, all of those things. And he's brought me in, and I'm a partner, and we've made accommodations for all of this stuff. Unveiled it at the town, they loved it, and the first thing was said, "Well, it doesn't meet any of our zoning. I don't think you can do this." Exact response. It's going on right now. So we're preparing to go before the zoning board to follow on our swords to determine whether or not they're going to see fit to allow us to do this. But here we have a new employer, 1,200 new jobs. He's willing to bring the housing and all of the necessary things for his employees to be there, self-contained unit. And by the way, did I mention that this is an industrial zone? And there isn't a residential unit within a mile of the place. Okay, and essentially we were told, these are your impediments, and they're pretty significant to overcome in order to get this project done. So in real life, that's what's going on. So.
Okay.
We're solving the world's problems right up here on the stage.
Heck yeah.
Yeah. Oh, we got the mic.
Okay, Kate Kuhn, Peterborough, New Hampshire, citizen, but a planning zoning junkie. Everything that Dick said, I was writing down because every town thinks it's special. And so our needs are so special that you must, et cetera, et cetera. But it's not like that. And you spoke to it exactly right, that it's the neighborhood defenders. And a couple of people have said that it's the majority wants one thing, but won't speak up. It's 6 people on Middle Hancock Road, pardon me, don't quote this, but who are there. So there's a book called Neighborhood Defenders, and there's one called Fixer Uppers, and we're starting to review them and put them in our quarterly newsletter, and hoping to get the word out that there's another way to frame the dialogue. And anyway, it's going to be spicy out there, but this is a great tool.
I'm going to cheat and stand up. I was thinking about that 200 feet of frontage. And does the zoning atlas talk at all about how much that costs the town every year?
think, I don't believe so. I know that would probably be a question for our leadership team. The answer is it's probably not up there, but it's certainly something that I think folks would look at, and I think would agree that we talk about sort of, are we maximizing the land that we have where we want to build it, like Dick talked about? And I think the answer would likely be no, right? You could do more on certain properties than you're currently doing, which would help prevent some of the sprawl, help make the land more valuable, and maximize sort of what you're getting out of that acreage there.
But you're right about the cost. Think of 10 houses and how much it costs to plow 1,000 feet and maintain that road. I love your point of view.
Ivy, we should have put that question back to you.
That's
I should
it.
have been asking that for you to answer. Do you have, Joe, I see your hand, or I'll get to you before we finish. Molly.
Thanks, Dick. I'm Molly Lynn Owen. I live in Manchester. I serve on the Manchester Planning Board. And I think when we hear density, everyone thinks apartments. But I've been on the Manchester Planning Board for almost 3 years now. And with a few exceptions, we've mostly seen luxury rate, large apartments come before us. No one's building condos. No one's building single family homes or duplexes, a couple single family homes. So my question is, what would it take to build the wealth that Sarah mentioned and create more units that are able to be purchased? My family's made a number of home offers. We're still in an apartment, but we have 2 jobs. We have, 2 income family, college educations, can't find a place to buy, but there are lots of luxury apartments that even would be unwise for us to move into. So my question is, what would happen? What would need to happen to create more of those ownership opportunities across the state, either manufactured housing or duplexes?
Okay,
Dick, you want to talk to
so
economics?
when I speak of density, I'm not just speaking of multifamily or condo or density. It comes down to residential as well. So if we take a lesson from our forefathers, and you're on the Manchester Planning Board, so I'll choose Manchester because I know it well. When the mill yard was built, the manufacturing went into a certain portion of the town. What's the next thing that sprung up around it? Workforce housing. What's the next thing that sprung up around that? Single family housing. Water, sewer, they were lots as low as 2,500 square feet that could take a single family house. 5,000 square feet is more than sufficient if you have water and sewer to them. Okay, so why don't we do some planning and look at it again and say, we're going to take this grid, this 100 acres, and we're going to say it's rezoned to 5,000 square foot lots. You'd get single family this fast from builders. Okay, because the cost of the land would be low, the utilities are already there, and we have so many opportunities to do this. We could take mills now that you've seen what we've done with the mill yard. Okay, that was a zoning change. Didn't cost government a thing. They asked us what we wanted, and we took the zoning book at the time in 1988 with Bob McKenzie, and I put the zoning book on the table, and I said, everything that's in the zoning book belongs in that mill yard. And the government bought it. To the credit of the board man, all that they bought it. Look what's happened to the mill yard now. We were 10% occupied with 5.2 million feet. Now we're 95% occupied on 4.9 million feet. It's a testament to success. But if we go back to the way we used to develop and how Manchester was developed, then you're going to solve your affordable housing problem. But it all comes down to the 4-letter word again. You want 5,000 square foot lots. You want to be able to put a single family in that 5,000 square foot lot. By virtue of the fact that it's a small lot, it's going to be a smaller starter home. By virtue of the fact that the land is going to cost you less and the materials are going to cost you less because it's a starter home, you can afford to sell it and still make a profit at an affordable price.
If I might just add to that, I love your question, and I love that you're standing there with your baby and here today. So, and another planner for the future, which is great. You're the quintessential story of a young family who is struggling to find a home, right? I've heard it so much in the last year as we've been working on our housing needs assessment. And one of the things that, like you, people want smaller homes They don't want to maintain a big yard. They want a small yard. They want a walkable community. Where do you find that in New Hampshire? And why can't you find that in New Hampshire, which is why we're all sitting here? And so one of the things we know from the examples you've seen are the 1 acre, 2 acre, 3 acre, and evidently 10 acre requirements. Where do these numbers come from? Are they, how random can you get, or maybe not random? I don't know, but it feels there's some randomness there. Why can't we rely on science and to decide on density, and then we take the guesswork out of it? If science says you, for that particular property, and we look at the wetland, the quality of the soil, et cetera, what can the soil handle, and let science determine it? Maybe it can handle 10 units, 20 units, but maybe it can only handle 1 unit. But if it's down to the science, it takes this guesswork out of it, which is another thing I'd love to see the Atlas do, is to tell us which communities have science-based density determinants.
Joe, why don't we get your last one in
None.
quick and then we'll wrap it, because as the moderator, I can't be the one that lets us go too far over here.
Great. Thank you, Nick, and thank you to everyone. I've heard a lot, and I want to echo a lot of the comments that Dick has made about what developers are allowed to do under existing law. And so when I look at the zoning atlas, I see a great list of examples of ways that government interference has ruined a lot of our communities and has brought up barriers that are prevented. And Margaret, you made some comments about how you view this solution as more government zoning authority to kind of reverse it. But wouldn't the easier and the simpler way to simply just be removing those barriers and getting back to how we used to build our communities, instead of saying, okay, we're going to have the code as it is and we'll add more barriers to it? Because I think we have the same ends in minds, but I just think we have different means to getting there. And I would be of the approach of looking at the zoning map and saying, all right, let's get back to the basics, remove those barriers, and let the market do as it wants without adding additional layers of requests. So last question, I know, but it's a big philosophical question. How do we get to those ends without, I don't view it as more government, more staff at the town halls being the solution to it. But I really think, just stepping back and seeing what happens, understanding the restrictions that have been put in place by zoning, getting back. So I guess, I don't know if I really have a question, but just as a response to what you had stated, finding that middle ground between more government and less government to get to where we need to go, I think is the overarching question we need to leave here with.
I think it's a great question and a great point, and I love ending on a philosophical note here. Zoning and planning and regulation is supposed to be a balance between the private market and the government's role in helping to regulate the outcome of the private market. There is supposed to be a balancing act there. I think if we went back totally to sort of full-on unregulated property rights, that would not necessarily lead to more affordable outcomes for the average person, right? Because private companies and private developers do have an interest in making a profit, right? So a completely unregulated land use market is not necessarily going to lead to more housing for more affordable housing for people, or more shelters, or more services and institutions for individuals who need that. So there has to be a balancing act. And I think that the obligation of local officials, state officials, and policymakers is to constantly look at that balancing act and to look at what the needs are and to try to best meet those needs. But I appreciate the comments and the question.
And I have to agree with her as a developer. I would not want unregulated development under any circumstances. But more importantly, another thing that the Atlas has pointed out, which is very blatantly clear when you look at this, is there's no standardization. From one town to the next, the regulations go from here to here, back up to here again. I mean, developers are looking for, you don't want to lose your market, so your time is really valuable and you need to get through the regulatory process, which is very burdensome. But more importantly, with no standardization and no standard interpretation, you're at the whim of whoever is interpreting it at the local level And it may kill your project just because they interpreted that the building envelope is the only thing that comes out versus the parking and the curtilage, and your density went from 120 down to 90 as a result of it. I mean, you know, so I believe that she's correct, that we need the regulation. It's just if we could standardize it some way and make it so that everybody's interpretations were the same, then that would help developers right out of the chute.
Thank you all for the great questions, and thank you to our panelists for the discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret, Sylvia, Dick, and Nick for a great discussion. So we're going to wrap up now because we promised to finish by 10:15 and we're already over that. I want to thank all of you here in person and everybody online for joining us today. I can tell you that this is really just the beginning of the project, because while we've completed the tool, it's now on all of us, those of us involved in the center and New Hampshire Housing and the Office of Planning and Development, but really all of you, all of the people out there who are community leaders, planners, municipal officials, policymakers, researchers, advocates, to use this tool to have those kind of spicy conversations that somebody mentioned earlier. Those spicy conversations need to happen at every community about the way we're regulating housing production, because the only way that we're going to solve this affordable housing crisis is by making those reasonable adjustments that we need to make. So hopefully this tool will be useful to that. We're committed to continuing this project, to keeping the Atlas updated, and to continue to generate research and findings from it. But we look for your support and help in doing so. So thank you again, everybody, for coming today. With that, we'll close.